Disclaimer.
Every screen in America is showing the same thing right now. Missiles arcing over Iranian airspace, fighter jets banking hard over the Persian Gulf, generals standing at podiums talking about targets destroyed and objectives achieved. And by every military metric they're describing, we are winning. 2,000 targets struck, 19 Iranian naval vessels sent to the bottom, nuclear enrichment facilities reduced to rubble. Operation Epic Fury, by Pentagon standards, is a textbook success. But here's what no one on television is explaining to you. On March 2nd, while those briefings were still happening, something far quieter occurred. And it will hit your wallet harder than any missile ever could. A single underwriter at Lloyd's of London, sitting in front of a screen in the City of London, signed off on a war risk cancellation notice. Not a declaration of war, not a naval order, just an insurance document. And within 72 hours of that notice going out, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz collapsed to nearly zero. Think about that for a moment. The most strategically important waterway on the planet, a 21-mile-wide choke point that carries roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply, didn't close because of a naval battle. It didn't close because of underwater mines or a blockade or some dramatic military confrontation. It closed because an insurance clerk said no. Because when war risk coverage disappears, ships don't move. It doesn't matter how many aircraft carriers we have in the Gulf. It doesn't matter how many Iranian targets we've hit. Without insurance, no captain loads 2 million barrels of crude oil onto a supertanker and sails it into a conflict zone. The economics simply don't allow it. Have you noticed the price at your gas station this week? On day one of Operation Epic Fury, Brent crude was sitting at $70 a barrel, already elevated but manageable. By day 5, it had climbed past $82. That's a move that took years to build in normal markets, and we did it in less than a week. At the pump, that's already translating to 5 to 10 cents per gallon added daily in many parts of our country. And we are only on day 5, with no ceasefire in sight and no counterparty capable of negotiating one. This is not a foreign policy story. This is a grocery bill story, a gas pump story, a utility bill story, and the mechanism driving it is something most financial commentators haven't even begun to explain properly. Let me take you back to what the Strait of Hormuz actually means in physical terms, because the numbers are almost incomprehensible until you make them concrete. Every single day, roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through that 21-mile channel. Oil heading to Japan, South Korea, China, India, Western Europe. And yes, it affects our prices too, even though we're the world's largest producer. Alongside that, oil moves natural gas, about 20% of global LNG supply. And almost nobody talks about the fertilizer. About a third of the world's sulfur and ammonia, the chemical backbone of industrial agriculture, moves through those same waters. One waterway, one insurance market, and suddenly all of it stops. Iran didn't need a sophisticated naval strategy to make this happen. That's what makes this situation so different from every conflict scenario the Pentagon wargamed. A handful of cheap surveillance drones, the kind that cost a few $1,000s apiece, operating near the approaches to the strait was enough, not to sink ships, not to fire on tankers directly, just to exist near the waterway and be visible to satellite imagery. Because the moment those drones appear in Lloyd's of London risk models, the actuarial math changes completely. Ensuring a very large crude carrier through that zone goes from expensive to effectively impossible overnight. The ship doesn't need to be hit, it just needs to be theoretically hittable. That's all it takes for the global insurance market to walk away. We're watching a $200 million supertanker being stopped not by a torpedo, but by a spreadsheet. Right now, as of this week, approximately 150 tankers are anchored in holding patterns outside the strait. Ships loaded with crude oil, sitting and waiting, burning through their own fuel reserves, their owners paying demurrage costs of $50,000 to $80,000 per day just to sit still. Their captains are receiving the same message every morning. No war risk coverage available for transit. Stand by. The oil aboard those ships was already sold. Contracts were signed. Refineries on the other end are already calculating shortfalls, and every day those ships sit, the downstream pressure builds. Here's what should grab our attention. The U.S. military has not lost a single engagement. Our forces have performed exactly as designed. And yet, the economic disruption is unfolding exactly as if we had, because the mechanism that distributes oil around the world isn't military. It's financial. It runs on insurance, on letters of credit, on shipping contracts, on the quiet confidence that a cargo loaded in the Gulf will arrive at its destination. The moment that confidence evaporates, the physical flow stops, and it doesn't matter how many aircraft carriers are standing by. What if I told you this is actually a known vulnerability, something experts have written about for decades? And yet our financial markets spent the last week pricing this conflict as if the strait would stay open? Pop quiz. What happened to global oil markets the last time the Strait of Hormuz faced a serious disruption threat? In 2019, after tanker attacks in the Gulf of Oman, crude spiked 15% in a single session. That was a threat. This is an actual closure. The gap between those two scenarios, in terms of price impact, is measured not in percentage points, but in multiples. Now, you might be thinking, we produce our own oil. We're energy independent. Why does a war in the Persian Gulf hit our pump prices? It's a fair question, and the answer is one of those deeply frustrating structural realities of our economy. Global oil is priced on a single world market. When Brent crude goes up, every barrel everywhere goes up, including West Texas Intermediate, including whatever came out of the Permian Basin last Tuesday. Our refineries buy crude at market prices. Your gas station buys refined product at market prices. The word independence in the phrase energy independence refers to production volume, not price insulation. We produce enough, but we sell into and buy from the same global market as everyone else. That's the system. It was built that way, and it doesn't change overnight. So here we are. Day 5 of a military operation that, by every combat metric, is succeeding. And simultaneously, the mechanism that actually connects Persian Gulf oil to American consumers, the insurance market, the tanker fleet, the freight networks, has effectively frozen. The gap between military success and economic outcome has never been wider, and the bill from that gap doesn't get mailed to the Pentagon. It gets mailed to us. The real question now isn't whether our military won the engagement. The question is how long this closure lasts, because the duration is everything. A 72-hour disruption is a market blip. A 2-week closure changes the inflation calculus for our entire economy in ways that reach into your mortgage payment, your 401k statement, your grocery cart, and your monthly credit card bill. And right now, for a reason almost no financial network has explained clearly, there's no obvious mechanism to end this disruption, even if everyone involved wanted it to stop. That reason is the most important thing you'll hear today, and we're going to get into it right now. Let's walk through exactly what happens next, not as a theory, but as a mechanical sequence that has already been set in motion, moving through the global supply chain like a slow-motion wave heading toward our shore. The strait closes, ships reroute. That's the first domino, and it sounds simple until you look at what rerouting actually means in physical terms. To go around the Strait of Hormuz, a tanker captain has 2 realistic options. He can sail south around the Arabian Peninsula and up through the Suez Canal, adding roughly 9 days to a voyage. Or he can go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adding 14 days or more each way, 28 days round trip on a route that was largely abandoned decades ago because the Suez and the Strait made it unnecessary. Either way, you've just taken a fleet of tankers that was completing, say, 6 round trips per year and turned it into a fleet completing 4. Effectively overnight, the world's oil transport capacity shrinks by a third, not because ships were sunk, but because geography now requires them to travel twice as far. And here's where the freight math hits home. When tankers take longer routes, freight rates climb. They've already doubled on certain Gulf routes in the past week. When freight rates climb, every cargo that moves on those ships gets more expensive. When cargo gets more expensive, the factory that bought the raw materials raises its prices. When the factory raises its prices, the distribution center raises its prices. When the distribution center raises its prices, the store shelf price goes up. That chain, from straight closure to your grocery receipt, takes approximately 60 to 90 days to fully transmit, which means the price increases Americans will feel most acutely aren't happening yet. They're already baked in. They're just still in transit. But now I want to tell you about something that almost no major financial network has led with, something that connects this crisis directly to a part of American life that feels completely unrelated to the Persian Gulf: farming. About a third of the world's sulfur and ammonia, the 2 primary chemical inputs for industrial fertilizer, moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar is one of the largest exporters of both. And this week, Qatari LNG facilities took drone strikes significant enough that Doha declared force majeure on several supply contracts, a legal term that means, essentially, we cannot fulfill our obligations due to circumstances beyond our control. That declaration matters enormously because force majeure isn't just a contractual formality. It's a signal to every buyer downstream that they need to find supply somewhere else, immediately, and pay whatever the spot market demands. Now consider the timing. Spring planting season in the United States begins in roughly 6 to 8 weeks. American farmers are right now, this week, this month, taking delivery of the ammonia they pre-purchased months ago for spring application. Some of that supply chain runs directly through Qatar and the Gulf. An ammonia shock arriving in late March or early April doesn't hit Wall Street first. It hits the farm gate first, it hits the co-op first, it hits the cost of producing a bushel of corn or a pound of soybeans first, and then, 90 to 120 days later, it hits the price of every processed food product that uses those commodities as inputs. This is the domino chain the financial networks aren't drawing for you. Oil prices get the headlines. The fertilizer angle is the one that quietly reshapes your food bill for the rest of the year. Have you lived through something like this before? Many of our audience has, because we've seen this exact script play out, and the last time it ran, it changed American politics for a decade. October 1973, the Arab oil embargo, OPEC cuts production, stops exports to the United States, and within 2 months, the price of oil quadruples. Gas lines stretch around city blocks. Odd even rationing at the pumps. Your license plate number determined what day you could buy gas. The Dow Jones falls nearly 50% from its 1973 peak. Nixon's approval rating, which had nothing to do with Watergate at the time in terms of public anger, dropped 20 points. Not because of the political scandal, but because of the gas station on the corner. People feel energy prices personally, physically, daily. There is no abstraction. You drive to the station, you see the number, you feel it immediately. That was 1973. Now here's why the setup today is structurally more dangerous, not less. In 1973, Saudi Arabia was a swing producer with enormous spare capacity. The world had a relief valve. Within months of the embargo lifting, production ramped back up and markets stabilized, painfully, slowly, but it happened. Today, according to the International Energy Agency, total OPEC Plus spare capacity that could realistically come online quickly amounts to roughly 206,000 barrels per day. The Strait of Hormuz was moving 17 to 21 million barrels per day. Do that math with me. We're talking about a production cushion that covers less than 1% of the disrupted flow. There is no swing producer large enough to fill this gap. The relief valve that existed in 1973 simply does not exist in 2026. We built our entire global energy architecture around the assumption that the strait stays open. And now that assumption has been stress tested in real time. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which we drained heavily during the 2022 energy crisis, sits at levels well below its pre-2022 capacity. It was designed as a 90-day buffer. At current drawdown rates in a genuine supply shock, independent analysts estimate it functions more like a 30 to 40-day bridge. It buys time. It does not solve the structural problem. And now we arrive at the reason this particular crisis has no obvious exit ramp. The reason a ceasefire hasn't been announced. The reason back-channel negotiations, which normally begin within days of any major military engagement, have produced nothing. And it comes down to a single, sobering fact about who's actually on the other side of this conflict right now. Iran's supreme leader is dead. The strike on the leadership compound in Tehran was militarily precise and strategically, from a pure warfare perspective, logical. Eliminate command and control, fragment the opponent's decision-making. But here's the unintended consequence that no war game fully modeled. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not structured like a conventional nation-state. It is a theological hierarchy, and at its apex sits one man, the supreme leader, who alone holds authority over the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. The regular Iranian military, the Iranian president, the parliament, none of them command the IRGC. Only the supreme leader does. The IRGC controls the drones. The IRGC controls the missile batteries. The IRGC controls the proxy networks in Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon that have the capability to keep this conflict active indefinitely. The body responsible for selecting a new supreme leader, the Assembly of Experts, has been bombed twice in the past week. It is currently meeting, according to reports filtering through regional intelligence sources, in a hospital basement outside Tehran. It has no communications infrastructure. It has no security. And even if it successfully convened and named a successor tomorrow, that successor would have zero established authority over IRGC commanders who have spent decades answering to one man and one man only. Military hierarchies built on personal loyalty don't transfer that loyalty to a stranger by committee vote in a basement. Think about what that means practically. A war requires two parties who can make a decision. Right now, the United States government can make decisions. The Iranian government cannot, not the decisions that matter. The Interim Council has no mechanism to order a stand-down. IRGC field commanders are operating on pre-existing contingency orders, which means the drones keep flying, the harassment near the strait continues, and the insurance market stays closed. Not because anyone is actively choosing to continue the conflict, but because the command structure that could end it doesn't currently exist. This isn't a political footnote buried in a foreign policy briefing. This is the mechanism that sets the duration of your disruption. And duration, as we established, is everything. There's a concept in economics called a supply shock, a sudden, unexpected disruption to the availability of a critical input. Supply shocks are uniquely difficult for central banks to manage because they don't respond to interest rate policy. The Fed can raise rates to cool demand. The Fed can cut rates to stimulate borrowing. But the Fed cannot drill an oil well. It cannot reroute a tanker. It cannot reconstitute an Iranian command structure. When a supply shock hits an economy that is already carrying high interest rates, high household debt, and elevated grocery prices, as ours is right now, the policy toolkit is essentially empty. You can't cut your way out of $100 oil. You can only wait it out. And the clock on that waiting game is now running. Federal Reserve data already shows core inflation, which had been slowly trending toward the Fed's 2% target, embedded at levels that gave policymakers almost no room before this week. Goldman Sachs economists, in a note published Wednesday, explicitly stated that any strait closure extending beyond 2 weeks eliminates all projected Fed rate cuts for 2026, every single one. That means mortgage rates stay where they are. That means auto loans stay where they are. That means credit card rates, which a third of American households are actively carrying balances on, according to the Federal Reserve's own consumer finance survey, stay where they are. The Strait of Hormuz closure isn't just an energy story, it's a credit story, it's a housing affordability story, it's a small business cash flow story. Every downstream financial pressure that American households were already managing gets heavier, and the weight arrives not as one announcement but as 1,000 individual monthly statements, each slightly worse than the last. You can't see that on a map of missile strikes, but you will feel it in your mailbox. And the math, the cold, specific, unavoidable math of what happens if this extends past 2 weeks, is where we need to go next. Let's do the math together, because this is the part nobody on financial television is walking through clearly, and you deserve to see the actual numbers before they show up on your monthly statements. Brent crude closed this week above $84 a barrel. That's already a $14 move from where we started before Operation Epic Fury, in less than 5 trading days. Now, Goldman Sachs and Wood Mackenzie, two of the most widely cited energy research firms on Wall Street, have both published the same warning independently this week. If the strait closure extends beyond 2 weeks, Brent crosses $100. That's not a worst-case fringe scenario. That's the base case if the current status quo simply continues without resolution. And as we just established, there is currently no negotiating counterparty capable of producing a resolution. At $100 oil, here's what the transmission looks like into your daily life. Regular gasoline nationally moves toward $4.50 to $5 per gallon, depending on your state and regional refinery capacity. Your average American household drives roughly 15,000 miles per year, which at 25 miles per gallon means about 600 gallons consumed annually. A $1.50 per gallon increase costs that household around $900 per year, or $75 per month, just in fuel. That's before you touch the second-order effects. The delivery surcharges on every package that arrives at your door, the transportation costs embedded in every product on every store shelf, the heating oil and natural gas bills for homes in the Northeast and Midwest heading into late spring. Moody's Analytics estimated in their March briefing that a sustained $100 oil environment adds between $20 and $35 per month to average household expenditures across all categories. That sounds manageable in isolation, but stack it on top of grocery prices that are already running 20% above 2021 levels, mortgage payments that haven't budged because rates haven't moved, and credit card balances that are now costing American households an average of 21% annually, and you start to feel the cumulative pressure. It's not one bill, it's every bill, slightly heavier, simultaneously. And here's the part that closes off the escape route we'd normally count on. In every previous energy shock, the Federal Reserve had room to maneuver. In 2020, when the pandemic crushed demand and oil went briefly negative, the Fed cut rates to zero and flooded the system with liquidity. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit, there was room to cut. The Fed's standard playbook for an economic slowdown is to lower rates, make borrowing cheaper, stimulate spending, cushion the blow. But a supply shock is not a demand problem. You cannot stimulate your way out of a physical shortage. And if the Fed cuts rates while oil is at $100 and food prices are climbing, it risks reigniting the inflation it spent 2 years fighting. Goldman's economists said it plainly. Every projected rate cut for 2026 is now off the table if the closure holds. Mortgages stay elevated, car loans stay elevated, business credit stays tight. The soft landing our economy was carefully navigating just got a lot harder to stick. Now let me bring in a clock that every American who follows politics understands instinctively, because it's ticking loudly in the background of every decision being made in Washington right now. November 3rd, 2026, the midterm elections, 8 months away. History on this point is about as close to a law as political science gets. No president has survived a prolonged energy shock at the ballot box. Not Nixon after 1973, not Carter after 1979. Energy inflation is unique among all economic pressures, because it is the one type that voters experience physically, personally, and daily. At the pump, on the utility bill, at the grocery checkout. It's not an abstraction in a GDP report. It's a number on a sign you drive past every single morning, and that number has a direct line to voter sentiment that no other economic indicator can match. This creates a pressure dynamic in Washington that is real and enormous. There is every political incentive in the world to find a resolution quickly, to get those tankers moving, to get Lloyd's writing coverage again, to get Brent back below $80 before summer driving season, turns gas prices into the only story American voters are following. That pressure is genuine, and it matters. But here's the collision. The political need for a fast resolution runs directly into the structural reality we've already established. You cannot negotiate a ceasefire with a command structure that doesn't exist. You cannot call a number and reach someone with authority to order the IRGC to stand down, because that person does not currently occupy a chair. The math and the politics are on a direct collision course, and one of them has to give. Either the political pressure finds a creative workaround, back-channel arrangements, proxy negotiations through Oman or Qatar, some kind of de facto local ceasefire that doesn't require a formal agreement, or the timeline extends and November starts looking very different than any current projection assumes. That tension between what needs to happen politically and what is structurally possible right now is the most important variable in your financial planning for the next 6 to 8 months. Not what the Fed says at its next meeting, not what the jobs report shows, this. So what do you actually do with this information? What has history shown us works when the Fed loses its ability to cut rates into a supply shock? Let's talk about gold, and let's talk about silver. Not as abstract investment concepts, but as a historical pattern your audience has lived through in real time. JP Morgan raised its gold price target to $6,300 per ounce by December 2026. Gold is already trading near $5,400 this week, meaning JP Morgan's own analysts see roughly another 17% move from here before year end, and that forecast was published before the full scope of this week's Strait disruption was priced in. The World Gold Council reported this month that central bank gold purchases from nations including China, India, Poland, and Turkey are running at the highest sustained pace since the 1960s. These are not retail investors chasing a trend. These are sovereign treasuries making 10 and 20-year allocation decisions. Think about the 3 moments in modern American financial history when gold made its most decisive moves. The 1973 oil embargo. Gold surged as the dollar lost purchasing power and the Fed found itself paralyzed between fighting inflation and supporting a weakening economy. The 1979 Iranian Revolution and second oil shock. Gold went from $200 to $850 in 18 months as energy inflation made traditional fixed income assets essentially worthless in real terms. In 2008 to 2011, as the Fed held rates near zero for years following the financial crisis, gold climbed from $800 to $1,900. In every single one of those episodes, the common thread was a Federal Reserve that had lost its normal policy flexibility, a Fed that was trapped between competing pressures and could not deploy its standard toolkit without making something else worse. That is precisely the environment we are entering right now. And then there's silver. Silver follows gold in these cycles, but historically with a delay and an amplification. When gold moves 20%, silver has repeatedly moved 40 to 60% in the same macro environment once it catches the momentum. The gold to silver ratio right now sits at historically elevated levels, meaning silver is statistically cheap relative to gold by the measure of their own historical relationship. Every time the Fed has been paralyzed in a supply shock environment, 1973, 1979, 2008, silver's delayed move has been sharper and faster than gold's once it began. That's not a prediction. That's a documented pattern in Federal Reserve data and commodity price histories going back 50 years. Your audience knows this. Many of them bought silver in 1979 or 2008. They know what that chart looks like when it moves. The point isn't to tell you exactly what to buy or when. That's between you and your financial advisor, and every situation is different. The point is to recognize the pattern for what it is, and to understand why this moment rhymes so clearly with the moments that came before it. When paper assets face inflation pressure from a supply shock and the central bank cannot ride to the rescue with rate cuts, the assets that have historically preserved purchasing power are the ones with physical scarcity and no counterparty risk. That's the logic. It's not new, it's not exotic. It's the lesson every major energy shock of the last 50 years has taught, at considerable cost, to the Americans who didn't see it coming in time. Here's where we are. The Strait of Hormuz didn't close with a bang. There was no decisive naval battle, no dramatic moment of military defeat. It closed with an insurance cancellation notice, a quiet document that made 20% of the world's oil supply untouchable within 72 hours. The military operation is succeeding by every combat metric, and simultaneously, the economic disruption is unfolding as if it weren't, because the system that actually moves oil around the world isn't military, it's financial. It runs on confidence in coverage and the quiet assumption that cargo will arrive. That assumption is currently suspended. The bill from that suspension doesn't arrive at the Pentagon. It doesn't show up in a press briefing or a military communique. It shows up in your utility statement, in your grocery receipt, in your 401k quarterly summary, in the mortgage rate that refuses to come down. It arrives not as one dramatic event, but as 100 small cumulative pressures, each one explainable in isolation, each one more manageable sounding than the total picture actually is. You now see the total picture. And there is one more actor in this story who hasn't made its move yet. The actor whose decision in the next 72 hours will tell you more about where 2026 is headed than anything Jerome Powell says at his next press conference. Beijing holds $760 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. It sources nearly half its daily oil through the Strait of Hormuz. It has been watching this week's events with an attention and an urgency that no Western financial media outlet has adequately captured. Whatever China does next, whether it moves to stabilize, to exploit, or simply to accelerate its own strategic repositioning away from dollar-denominated assets, that decision is the next chapter of the story. And it is a chapter you need to be ready for before it's written. That's where we're going next.